Bama looking really kind of rough tonight. Josh, I know Alabama fans are going to be frustrated about LSU driving the field in the second half, but it's really the offense, right? And before we get into the offense, talk a little bit about how it's hard when a team's going for it every fourth down. And even if they're not getting a lot of yardage or performing great offensively, it's hard to stop them from scoring about 20 points.
Yeah, no, it's been pretty interesting today because I think we've had a lot of sort of near misses. I mean, Ohio State started the day with Nebraska, and it feels funny. Like every day we have like a series of games like that where we want to be super critical and say X team doesn't belong. It feels like everybody makes that point or proves it, and that's kind of where we're at. But to this game, and when we were having discussions about how this game was going to go, I expected LSU to score 15 to 20 points. I mean, LSU is out one starting offensive player for all their injuries. This was a top 5 offense in the SEC, and they're out one guy. Now it's their best player probably in Butte, but it's just one guy. The shocking thing is this is an LSU defense with 4 starters actually in the game, a defense that had been an absolute disaster in every phase. And Alabama's offensive line can't block them at all. They can't run the ball. When they've thrown the ball, it seems like every third play they give up a massive sack, and it's been interesting. Now Alabama has the ball back now. They're moving it well enough that maybe they can, just put up a field goal and put it away, but it has been concerning. But it's not a unique thing, right? I mean, I see we got a lot of people on here that are Florida fans, or at least Alex Compton, I guess, is posting enough for all of them. There are a lot of schools and a lot of fan bases that are probably feeling very nervous today. It's just been one of those early November days, I think, where stuff goes wrong. And the entire landscape of college football doesn't feel like anybody's proven themselves for sure.
We're seeing now, so Alabama got their first down of the second half with 6 minutes left to go, which is insane for this offense. And that's the one thing we've felt about Alabama all year is we've had some concerns on defense, but the offense has been there. What it seems to me is really, yeah, they've got offensive line issues, especially there's been some communication issues tonight. But Josh, does it feel to you a little bit like whenever a defensive coordinator throws a wrinkle, like we saw Elko throw the middle blitz at Alabama and they hadn't really seen it to an entire half to recover or adjust. Tonight, LSU's blitzing a lot more than they usually do. Does it seem to you that maybe O'Brien doesn't do a good job of adjusting?
Well, I think the biggest thing with Alabama watching them is that I don't think their offensive line can take a heavy blitz. I mean, that's what got them in the Texas A&M game. It felt like they adjusted a little bit. They've had issues off and on, but I mean, they can't handle it at all. Now, they do have injuries. The injuries have shaken them up. I don't know how much that's like a communication problem. It's something we talked about with Texas A&M, right? That people don't understand when you've got injuries like that. How much that has an effect on everything you want to do offensively. And LSU, A&M for all the quarterback problems probably had more issues with, they probably had more issues with their offensive line struggling than their quarterback struggling. And I think Alabama's going through the same thing. But no, it is interesting. If you, like us, had the opinion that maybe Alabama was going to really threaten Georgia in the SEC championship game, it's hard to watch this game and feel like Alabama is going to handle Georgia at the line of scrimmage. Granted, it's hard to watch the Georgia game and feel like they were going to score a lot. And this, maybe this is going to make a lot of people mad, but in terms of the ability of the offense to move the ball and like the ability of, a team to have a vertical passing game, there's a serious argument that LSU might be better than Georgia. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on with all these games. Ohio State, it's easy to blame them for Nebraska, but Nebraska has a pretty good defense. I mean, how much of that is us underrating them? And Ohio State's defense is actually really good against Nebraska. So it's everything about this game to me is just incredibly confusing. Or I say the game, like everything about all these games. I have the Alabama one in the corner, but all of them have been confusing. I think, maybe at this point, because I know a lot of people are commenting on it, I think it'd be good to touch on the Florida game. I'm trying to listen.
They're calling intentional grounding because I'm guessing Jameson Williams was covered up. I don't know. I think that's weird.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a weird fly. Yeah, it looks like he was covered up, but I mean, that's a weird. I don't know the rule there, but I'm guessing. It's
Okay,
intentional grounding.
so Alabama's running. He throws the ball at his receiver that's like 2 yards deep, but that receiver was covered up, so it's the same as if you threw it at a lineman. It's not an eligible receiver in the area, and that's why he dodged the ball. That was really confusing me. Um,
He dodged the ball, but is it intentional grounding? That's what I don't understand. Like, I guess so, because if you throw it into the dirt and there's only
yeah,
offensive
it didn't
linemen
cross the
around,
line,
it's
and it
intentional.
didn't cross the line of scrimmage, so you can't throw it away that way either. You throw it at nobody, it doesn't cross the line of scrimmage. That's what that is. But let's talk for a bit about some of these other games, right? So Michigan State beats Purdue. What the Florida was it like 40-10 last I looked?
40? I saw 30-10. Did they
No,
score
it's
some
it's
more?
40-10 now into the third quarter.
Wow.
South Carolina. So a lot of teams. Louisville still up 24-17 on Clemson. Michigan is eking it away 27 on Indiana. Oregon has retook the lead and holding on at 17-9. Lots of stuff across the board, but I think the first one to start with is Michigan State Purdue. I went on a podcast for Kelly Ford Ratings this week, and I did a 10 pick uh, pick'em suite, and I picked Purdue to beat Michigan State straight up. And if you guys ever watch us talk about like our methodology for when we make picks, we don't do shock picks. We typically are going to pick favorites to win a game. And for me, with Michigan State playing Purdue, Purdue is a team that cannot run the ball but can do nothing but throw. It wasn't shocking to me at all that Purdue won that game. A lot of advanced stats. I know Parker Fleming at Stats of War has an advanced stats matchup. They had Purdue like a 7-point favorite in that game going in. I don't think it was surprising Purdue won. It shouldn't have been surprising Purdue won. I felt like it was almost a trap bet that that Michigan State was favored by a small amount to start with, and I think that proved true. Now Purdue could have easily lost the game, but I think that was telling of how. And I think Michigan exposed this, right? Just how weak in the back end Michigan State really was in that football game.
Yes, it's a little surprising, but like maybe this is why I get frustrated when people get mad at us about our rankings when we do top 10. Because they're like, oh, that's ridiculous. You got to have Iowa at number 2. Oh, that's ridiculous. You got to have Penn State in the top 10. And they go back to this win is a win is a win thing. And they're like, okay, you cannot use your eyeballs. You cannot take anything from wins and losses. You're not allowed to use your eyeballs. You just have to look at the win-loss column. Vegas doesn't have that restriction, and Vegas tells us what we need to know. There is no way an unranked team, or maybe Purdue was slightly ranked coming into this game, should be anywhere within 10 points or so against the number 3 team in the country. Is it kind of ridiculous, especially in this year, that we're not allowed to say, okay, look, like, are we going to look at Alabama tonight, and if they win, not move them around at all? Like, I don't understand why we can't use our eyeballs when we're doing our top 10 and not pretend like we don't see what we see.
Well, doing the top 10 tonight is going to be fun because there weren't very many teams that looked impressive. And if I feel like at noon and then 3:00 and then 6:00 and now we keep talking about a different team. So I have a feeling everybody in our top 10 people are going to complain about. But yeah, no, it is what it is, and we have to be able to use our eyeballs. Cincinnati, the final score looked decent, but I say decent, it didn't look that good. But Cincinnati was 2 goal line stands away from losing. The running back loses the ball, wasn't even really contacted. He's stretching the ball over the goal line trying to tie, and that was a really bad Tulsa team. It wasn't even by G5 standards an average team. That was a below average G5 team. So yeah, the eye test for everybody right now is pretty rough. Super chat from Moshe Clark. He said, at this point, I'm at survive and advance for Ohio State. This is 2007 vibes, and Georgia's far and away above everybody else. Do you agree with that? Georgia certainly took care of business. It took a while against Missouri. Now, Missouri is a particularly bad team. I'm not sure people fully appreciate how bad they are or how bad they've been in the second half of the season.
I think that the thing for me is I will give Georgia a ton of credit for not having. They haven't had a knucklehead game yet, and I'm not hugely impressed with the teams they've beaten, but I'm also not impressed with LSU this year, and Alabama might lose to them tonight. Like, they might hang on, they might convert this 3rd and 5 or whatever.
Yeah.
they might hang on and win ugly, but that's a knucklehead game. And they've already had one against A&M, who's a good team, but still, if you're an elite team, losing that game is not that great. So with Georgia, I don't know. I mean, I think they haven't been impressed. They haven't had an impressive slate of teams, but they've taken care of business and nobody else has.
Yeah, well, and LSU just forced a fumble here, and they're going to get the ball with 3.5 minutes left, down 6 in Alabama's territory. Yeah, nobody's looking impressive, and I think you probably have to move Alabama down, win or loss. But it's who do you move them past? Because Cincinnati wasn't impressive. I don't think Ohio State was terribly impressive. I'm not sure if LSU is or isn't worse than Nebraska. And Michigan State lost. Like, I'm trying to go down through my head right now.
It's like every other week we have to move Oklahoma way back up, even though like we want to punish them for barely beating Kansas, but then we got to move them back up because everybody else ahead of them screwed up. Alabama looks absolutely terrible tonight. And I honestly, like, the things that I've seen from Alabama and their inability to recover or adjust to what defenses are doing, even with the offensive line struggles or injuries, I can't comfortably put them anywhere near the playoffs right now.
No, I agree with you. And then Ed Orgeron runs the same pin and pull they did against Florida. I'm not sure if Orgeron realizes that everyone knows they like to run pin and pull. And now they're going to be like 2nd and 9. I guess you're in 4-down territory, but still. Yeah, I don't know where to put anyone. I mean, somebody's saying Oklahoma moves up to number 2. I mean, based off what? It's easy to say they've been better when Caleb Williams came back in the lineup because they beat up on a bad TCU and Texas Tech team. But that Kansas game was a straight up struggle bus win itself. So it just, I mean, I think there's a real argument, right, that everybody in college football does look bad, right? Everybody in football does look terrible, except for Georgia. And
Right.
Georgia's handling business. They're playing defense at a high level. You called out something, and I think you should take a bit of a victory lap, even if people think it's the wrong decision on saying Stetson Bennett's the right choice. And it's that Georgia, with their defense, and as much better as their defense is than any other defense in the country right now, just needs to be efficient offensively, move the ball down the field with their good backs, their good running offensive line, and they can score enough points to beat, it looks like, anybody. And if you watch the tail end of that game when Daniels came in, he missed a lot of passes. He does some things vertically that gives him some opportunities. But this year, with the teams that exist, it sure seems like all Georgia needs to do is put a guy in that can complete the 5-yard throw, not screw up, and run the ball, and they're going to be the national champion. Because I don't see anybody else. People might want to say Caleb Williams at Oklahoma, but I'm not seeing anybody else that looks like they're going to score a lot of points on them with any sort of consistency.
Yeah, I think that the issue is we want to compare what Georgia needs to do this year. We want to project previous years. I don't think 2021 Georgia beats 2020 Alabama or 2019 LSU. But like we always say, they're not playing football in that year. They're playing football in this year. And I've said for about 4 weeks now that Stetson Bennett's the starter, and not just because JT Daniels is hurt. And I think that I like Alabama's defense. I know I said earlier tonight that they didn't look great, but I like Alabama's defense, even if they give up a score here, and they lose. This game is not on the defense. I think, even having said that, if Alabama and Georgia played today, Stetson Bennett's going to score 27. Is Alabama scoring 27 on Georgia right now? I might have said yes last week, but after what I've seen today, there's no way.
I don't think Alabama scores 10 on Georgia today with the way their offensive line's played. No, not 10. Now, how much of that is – look, Alabama's offense has been pretty good all year. Even the A&M loss, they put up 38, and they moved the ball well. There were some fumbles and other things involved, right? Turnover in the end zone. So I want to be a little careful with overreacting to them because it may be a little bit more the offensive line or at least a one-off game, right? I've had a lot of conversations today with Penn State fans, or at least a couple Penn State fans, because I made the point that Penn State, people want to say the excuse that Sean Clifford's hurt and that's why the team's bad. But the point I've made is, okay, well, Indiana was sub 6 yards per attempt, and Iowa's 6 yards, 6 yards per attempt, and Illinois is sub 6 yards per attempt. Wisconsin was 7.5. It's not like they've had many good games. I mean, they had a pretty good game against Auburn where he was 8.8 yards per attempt, but that's like his third highest yard per attempt game in like 2 years. So the difference here, and a lot of people, I know people are always sort of maybe overly conscious of us being SEC homers. Alabama has been very effective offensively in many games this year. And so I'm a little hesitant to bury them off one bad game. And this is certainly a bad game, but it is one bad game.
I will say,
when
if we're talking about,
like when we're, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say the difference tonight. So Alabama's had injuries on the offensive line. And the difference tonight is Bryce Young has been running for his life all night, and they've struggled to put up points against LSU. Ohio State, I could not believe how clean a pocket Stroud had all night and could not put up more than the points that they did. That's what shocked me, was not that like I think Nebraska has a pretty sound defense, but they weren't getting any pressure really. And when they did get pressure, he had intentional grounding, he had multiple interceptions. So that's the difference to me between these two offenses. That gives me a little bit of thought that maybe Alabama can improve, but I'm guessing they need to get everybody healthy on the offensive line for that to be even a pipe dream. But either way, I don't see either of those teams scoring enough to beat Georgia right now.
No, I agree with it. I mean, and I knew this was coming. Tummy Tom's like, and here we go. I mean, look, here's the wild thing, right? Having watched Ohio State and Alabama both play today, if Ohio State played Alabama today, as bad as Alabama has played, how much does Ohio State actually win by?
I don't know that they do. I think both teams played really poorly. Nebraska is not good. Everybody wants to say that Nebraska is good because they played teams close. They still got 6 losses. So, look, LSU's not good either. That's the point. The point is LSU's offense is as good or better than Nebraska's defense. Neither one of those teams look good today. Both kind of were embarrassing. So I think that if either fan base right now is saying that they would definitely beat the other, they're kidding themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I don't know where to start. Stephen Light put up a super chat checking in, encouraging our work, and said congrats to you on the Braves. I don't know if you see that or you can throw it up.
I do not see that, but I certainly appreciate it.
Yeah, Stephen Light's a Penn State fan. He's been a pretty good guy to show up, and in the middle of us being a little negative on Penn State, he puts up the positive comments. So that's definitely appreciated. Yeah, I mean, look, right, like I'm looking here. Ohio State nearly beats Nebraska. Cincinnati nearly beats a bad Tulsa team. Michigan leads Indiana. Maybe that's the best of them, but they've got a loss. Wake Forest lost to North Carolina. Michigan State lost to Purdue. Alabama may win this game, and Georgia is the only one to soundly win. And look, Notre Dame beat Navy 34-6, but that was a tight game for most of it. Like they blew that out, something like the third quarter? I don't know who I can move up other than, do you want to move Oklahoma up for being idle 2 weeks off the Kansas game? I don't know that I do.
I don't want to, but I everybody else being bad is worse than being idle, I guess is fair to say. I mean, look, right now, what's Oklahoma's best win? Like not just best team that they've beaten, but best performance. Is it TCU? Because they gave up 30-something points. Is that their best game this year?
I think so. I think TCU, because Texas Tech's been really, really bad, right? So
terrible.
And TCU's not. I mean, am I crazy? TCU has a losing record, right?
They were 3-5 coming in today. I saw they were up on Baylor, which is another grossly overrated team. So, yeah.
Yeah, it looks like Alabama's didn't convert. Interesting play call. They did a naked blue, and that's a designed run where they're hoping that they crash so hard on the run that maybe Bryce Young could just run around the edge. That's a serious desperation call when you don't trust your run game enough to even have a chance to get 10 yards, and you don't trust yourself to be able to pass protect well enough to throw it, because they gave up a fumble and a short field position the last drive. Somebody says Young sacked again. I mean, that was a run. That was a tackle for loss. I don't know that I put that
That
down
was
as a
LSU
sack.
staying home. And not overcommitting to the run.
Yeah, I mean that's just where Alabama's at, and they call their last timeout, which is almost interesting in and of itself. So LSU is going to get the ball back with about 55 seconds to drive the length of the field. Yeah, and they're showing it, right? I mean, Alabama doinked an extra point, and so it's touchdown win. What a weird game, man.
Yeah, Alabama has had 2 missed kicks because of mishandles. So they missed the opening drive kick, and then they missed the extra point. And then to Alabama's kicker's credit, he almost hit both of them. So
Yeah,
and neither were his fault.
Yeah, when I saw at least the second one was a bad hold. I think they said the first one was. So let's touch on some of the others. So we mentioned it in passing.
What about Wake?
Yeah, what about Wake? Now, North Carolina is a solid, talented team, right? So I don't want to devalue that too much. It's not the worst thing in the world that you had a close game against North Carolina, but North Carolina was a 4-4 team. They were not a great team. My view, I don't really have a problem having Wake around 15th, but I just think Wake is who we thought they were. They were undefeated because they hadn't played a fantastic schedule. They've got a genuinely pretty darn good offense. The defense looked really suspect in that North Carolina game. And anybody that complained about an undefeated not being higher in the top 10, I mean, it's pretty obvious that they were who they were because of their schedule and really nothing else. So, that is what it is. Now, this is interesting because harking back to Les Miles, Ed Orgeron has used all his timeouts, and they used some of them. I know one early in this half because they were discombobulated, take a sack, and they have just burned literally half their time. So they're almost in Hail Mary nut mode. And he threw, I guess it's a comeback, so it's going to make it like 3rd and 11.
I saw somebody up the line in the chat trashing Max Johnson, and I don't think that's really fair. I think he's done really well this year, given they've got a patchwork offensive line too, right, Josh? So, what are your thoughts on not just him, but the offense in general, given what they've been up against?
Yeah, Darrell Rosenthal left for Kentucky, and it left them in a lurch. And they have Cam Wire, and they've had some other guys. I think they're out. Is it Deculus, the right tackle, is out
Deculus
too?
is back. He's playing hurt, I think.
Okay, so they've been suspect or injured pretty much all year, and that's just is what it is. Now we're on 4th and 9 now. So yeah, obviously we're distracted because we want to see if Alabama actually gets upset in this game. Super chat from Biscuits. Who do you think is the Heisman frontrunner right now? My pick is Will Anderson. I don't think it's not Will Anderson. I think he's the best defensive player, but I don't know that he has the statistics or the production to quite back it up. Now he could if he dominates the end of the year.
6 tackles for loss tonight. Something crazy. He had 2.5, 3 in the first quarter and a half. But yeah, defensive players aren't going to get it for whatever reason. Last week it was Kenneth Walker, and now that shine is off of that. I don't know. At least
really good play by the LSU player to get a hand down out of bounds. But keep talking.
So I don't know, Josh. It's got to be a quarterback. I mean, wouldn't it be funny if Stetson Bennett put up 400 on Alabama in the SEC championship game and won it? Who do you put? Give me 3 people you'd send in New York right now.
Yeah, and we got 5 seconds left, so I'm pretty distracted here to see if LSU can.
Why don't you play by play for the last 5 seconds, and then?
Yeah, I gotta see. I gotta see how this goes. I mean, LSU has to. They're on the 30-yard line. They have to score. They're gonna have to throw to the end zone because with 5 seconds, you don't have time to do 2 plays.
People are saying Caleb Williams. He's
played half a year, and I mean,
he's not even that. He's played 2.5, 3 games.
Game over.
You gotta have a little more intrigue, or try it again, Josh. For those of us that are still behind, do a play.
Yeah.
Okay, it's game over. So all the people that came to talk about be excited because Bama looked like they might lose. I guess we can move on to something else that would
Well,
have been would have
I
made
want
for
to
an
talk about
interesting
one.
show.
I want to talk about one thing there. What were your thoughts of the way LSU handled that late? Because it's easy to criticize them. Now, they didn't move the ball well the entire game, right? They had one touchdown off a fake punt. They had the second touchdown off a couple plays, including a pretty sketchy horse collar that put them in range of the red zone. And then in these last few drives, I mean, my biggest criticisms, I felt like they didn't do a very good job at all of just getting somebody the ball and letting them make a play. I mean, it was either sort of a direct run or throwing more than 10 yards downfield with Johnson, who's just not very accurate or good at reading the defense, and they couldn't block him. So,
Well, I mean, but look, they had 47, 50 seconds left. They took a sack on the first play, right? So, man, good look from Ed Orgeron running over to his fans, giving them some love. I showing appreciation. I think that's pretty cool. I think that given that, like they're on their own 30-yard line, and they ate up, like you said, half of that on the first play, and they still got to the 30-yard line with striking distance.
well, I don't really have a problem with the last drive because the time demanded the approach they took in taking dink and dunk. I'm really talking about the previous two drives because they had 3 shots to take the lead. And on the other 2 drives, I felt like they were greedy. I mean, Alabama's being pretty dominant. Yeah, I see the face mask now. Alabama was being pretty dominant in this game, but where they were really having the most trouble was when LSU was just getting somebody the ball short and letting them try to muscle for 3 to 5 yards. And again, and we talked about this early for people just now jumping in on our broadcast. LSU's out one, like their offensive line is sort of patchwork as it has been all year, but there's like skill position talent and whatnot. It's actually pretty intact. I mean, this was an offense that has the ability to score, and they were in a position to do so. So, I mean, I don't know why you don't just trust your guys and run your offense in the last few drives. I mean, it felt like somebody got, or Pete's got in his head that they needed to start taking shots to score to win this game, and they weren't patient. They didn't drive. They didn't take field goals. And if they'd taken field goals, they had 3 trips, I want to say, within the 30-yard line. They could have kicked 9 points in this game and won it. So I am pretty critical of, as much as LSU needs to get a lot of credit for the way they played this game defensively. They played an outstanding game, or Alabama played a terrible game. I'm not sure which, probably more the latter. I think there does need to be some genuine criticism for the way LSU approached the end of that game and trying to score. Because I just, they were not actually throwing the ball in the end zone so that they'd have a chance to score if somebody comes down to it, but they weren't also moving the ball. It was like trying to get 15, 20 yards every play.
It's interesting because I thought Alabama had similar, boneheaded approaches offensively when LSU's got a 7 or 8 man box and they're sending everybody all night, they're hoping that some of these longer developing plays materialize and they can punish them for it. But it took them 2.5 quarters to start throwing quick reads and quick, stuff to the flats. And then all they could do is throw to the flats. And it seems to me like Bill O'Brien really just can't adjust. I've said it before. I think with LSU, they did the best they could. I think that, to your point, though, that first drive, they came out and threw everything like kitchen sink at everybody in that first drive. And then they kind of changed in the second half, where they really did, given how much the Alabama offense was just floundering in the second half. The fact that LSU couldn't take advantage is pretty surprising. Josh, let's go back to the Heisman question so we can move on. Give me 3 people you'd send to New York right now.
3 people I'd send to New York right now. Gosh, there's no way to say this at the moment and not look like a total moron. Who do you send? Believe it or not, I would be inclined to keep Bryce Young in that list despite this game. I don't think it's his fault that they struggled. I mean, he was running for his life the entire game, and his body of work is still quite strong. I think CJ Stroud is probably in the conversation. I don't know that I would send him there personally. I've been pretty vocal on this. I think Stroud is the benefit of a set of circumstances. I I think it's too early for me to put Caleb Williams in that discussion, but he's trending in that direction given the field that's available. And then, man, I don't know. Like this week, I don't even know. Like I don't think Trayvon Henderson, as good as he's been, quite makes that level for me.
No, and he wasn't great today.
I mean, who do you put? I mean, like, so top quarterbacks in terms of yards per attempt, Caleb Williams and Stroud are second and third. Bryce Young's actually all the way down at 13th at 9.2 yards per attempt, but the level of competition genuinely is very different. Um, I think it's probably Williams, Stroud, and Young that are still the only three in the competition because I don't know who the heck else do you put in it. It's not a strong year.
If we're talking about the best players in the country, Will Anderson's got to be there. He's got to be there. Will Anderson not playing for Alabama tonight, Alabama loses. Like there's no question about it. If anybody watched that game, they saw, and there might be a difference in what voters will do versus what we would do. But if anybody's seen our top 10, they know that we don't really go with what voters would do. Josh, I'm sending Will Anderson probably over any of the three quarterbacks you mentioned. Matt Corral's out there. They only put up 27 points today on Liberty.
Corral honestly is probably the most valuable player on any team, but they're in rough shape due to everything that's going on. I think we got to go through some of these.
Let me shout out Joey. These morons got their own show because we've been working at it for 6 years and we put in the sweat equity. If you want to start your own show, we'll go follow the 7 people that watch it, and I'm sure it'll be great. Go ahead, Josh.
Well, man, like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, people are people. I don't get too riled up on it. But all right, so going through the super chats, Mike Farino. My takeaway as an OSU fan, only great team is Georgia. I don't see how anybody could possibly.
And is Georgia great, or is they just are they the only really good team?
I think they're great because the defense is that elite. They are great because the defense is that elite. I think the offense is good, maybe good moving on great. I'm not, and somebody's going to take that as an insult. Good moving on great means they're like well above average, top 15, bordering top 15 offense, which is all they need them to be. They're not a top 5 offense. They're not an elite score 40 on everyone offense, but their defense is so good they don't need to be, and nobody else has been anywhere near that consistent offensively. Biscuits, who do you think is the Heisman front runner? Okay, we got that. Killtack 9, I was going to come here talking trash about Cincinnati, but now I have nothing to say. Bama really struggling. Well, I mean, that was what we talked about, and I think a lot of people missed when we started. Like, we want to, like, you go at noon, I thought we were going to, or 2 o'clock, I thought we were going to have a conversation about, like, Ohio State. And then I thought we were going to have a conversation about Texas and Auburn. And then I thought we were going to have a conversation about Florida and South Carolina, and then Cincinnati and Tulsa, and then Alabama and LSU. Has anybody looked good? I mean, does anybody want to raise their hand and say, I'm proud of my team? I'm proud of my top 10 team today?
Josh, is there one difference, though, that Ohio State was playing Nebraska today, Alabama was playing LSU today, Cincinnati was playing 3-5 Tulsa today? That, to me, is the difference. We've got 3 weeks in a row now where Cincinnati, Cincinnati has played, what was it, Navy, they won by 7. Tulane, who's 1-8 and was playing with their third string quarterback, they struggled in that game. And then this is Tulsa, who's 3-6 now, that they struggled in that game. To me, there is a difference between, as much as I'm not super high on Nebraska, it's not Tulsa. And I'm not sure that Tulsa is going to beat Nebraska. And that's where I get a little frustrated. It's like they're struggling, and then they're struggling. Like, I can almost give Ohio State a little credit or a little bit of a benefit of the doubt because they're coming off of a rough Penn State game. They're struggling against an LSU or Nebraska, and then they're struggling against Kentucky after you've struggled against Tulane, after you've struggled against Navy. One of those is not like the other.
Yeah, no, I think that has to be said. These Nebraska teams or LSU teams or whoever would actually themselves handle Tulsa pretty readily. It's all pretty relative, and that was a point that needed to be made in one of the games today, and I'm blanking on it. Who was it? I'm gonna have to think about it. There was somebody today that had played a really weak schedule, and it was obvious today
Wake?
that it may have been Wake, but I don't think it was. It was really obvious, right, that certain teams get into the meat of their schedule. It was Liberty was one of them, right? Ole Miss is a good team. They're extremely banged up offensively. They're a little banged up even defensively. Liberty was a high-scoring team, and Liberty could barely move the ball in that game. They scored 14 points on a Ole Miss defense that's been extremely suspect in the SEC, right? So to me, that says a lot. That you get a team like that with Willis that a lot of people have as a first-round draft pick, and he looks straight pedestrian against an Ole Miss team that's had their struggles. And the expectation for Ole Miss is they put up 40 or 50 points. I mean, the problem is that Liberty puts up 14. And trying to, let me see, box score here, because I don't think it was particularly pretty. Yeah, Willis was 6.9 yards per attempt. They ran it pretty well. They had a couple long carries was a big part of it, but not a whole lot. So it's obvious that competition level is different, and a lot of people are going to point to UTSA. A lot of people are complaining about them not being ranked, but it's obvious that that's look. UTSA hasn't played a top 70 team.
No, UTSA's best opponent. Their best opponent is 3-6 TCU, maybe Illinois. Josh, did you have 45-42 Tennessee, Kentucky with 36 seconds left in the game? Is that
that's the one that's distracting me right now. And they had a 4th and 24 they converted. And then you talk about a dagger as a fan. I know as a kid, the team I went and watched, I remember there was one like that. I mean, there's nothing more gut punching than a late game, like 4th and 20 plus conversion. But yeah, no, I mean, who picked that game 45-42? And it says something I said on Twitter, which is I really think Tennessee is going to be the first real offense, maybe the only real offensive test for Georgia. That Tennessee's turned into a good offensive football team. Obviously, they're not a great defensive football team, and I don't think Georgia's going to lose to them. But for evaluation purposes, I think it's going to be maybe the most interesting test for them.
I think this is an interesting discussion, and you can keep chiming in on that as you also weigh in on this question. What do we do with Dan Mullen, given the results we've seen? Like the best result for Dan Mullen this year is a close loss to Alabama. What do we do with him if we're Florida administration? Like, this is really bad.
I don't know, man. You get to you're getting to the point where you may have no choice but to fire him, because I mean, maybe this is a one-off. Maybe you don't fire him this week. Maybe you say if you lose another one. But if this happens again, you just kind of have to assume the team has quit. And Tennessee's defense forces 4th and out, 29 seconds left, 2 timeouts. Yeah, Tennessee can nail it out. So game over, on to the next one. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I barely have words to describe that kind of a disaster.
And this is on the heels, Josh. You remember his whole kind of laissez-faire approach to the bowl game, and kind of excuse their horrible performance, and that he didn't end last season on a good note in terms of like the thing you talk about all the time is like administration building and kind of being the CEO part of that in the off season. Looks like there's a fox on the field, Arizona State USC. So it's that kind of left a sour taste in Florida fans' mouth at the end of last year. And then this year, it's bad to lose to South Carolina. Like East Carolina losing to them, Vanderbilt losing to them on the last play of the game. Those teams are frustrated. He's getting worked by South Carolina. This is inexcusable.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any good. I mean, they're 3rd and goal on the 7, up 40-17 right now. Emory Jones is actually, and from a box score perspective, hasn't been bad. 9.6 yards per attempt, 2 touchdowns with interceptions. About to say, but it's the disjointedness of it and the fact that they can't run it. And I mean, the biggest thing is that their defense is imploded. Is a kind word. South Carolina is a really terrible offense. So I'm shocked to the point that I don't even know what to comment about it. It's just an unwatchable nightmare at this point, for
And
lack of better words.
and how do you, as a quarterback whisperer and an offensive guru, how do you have your offense so ill prepared at quarterback in general that you have the result we had last week? Like, it's one thing to not score against Georgia. It's another to have Georgia basically be up 3-0 going into the half and you give them 3 touchdowns. I don't know. We got to get to some super chats, though. So, Josh, here's one you can take. What does the committee do with a one-loss non-conference champion, Georgia, if the other 4 conferences have undefeated or one-loss conference champions? Like, basically, if Georgia loses to Alabama in the SEC championship game and Alabama wins out,
And then Michigan has to win out. Is there an undefeated in the Pac-12? There's not, right? There's not in the ACC anymore. So it's just Michigan and the Big 12. So I don't know that it's a problem. There's only 2 others, right? Am I missing
what do you
one?
do? Like, if Georgia loses to Alabama, Cincy wins out, Oklahoma wins out, Ohio State wins out, and then like I don't know what you do. The better question: if Alabama loses to Auburn and then Georgia loses, like you could have a 2-loss SEC champion not make it in, and the loser of that game make it in. This really, Josh, is just a weird year.
Yeah, it is. Now there's a lot of like, and I was mentioning this earlier, right? You want to be really careful in these situations of not overreacting to the one game. Alabama's offense has been very good to this point in the year. Their defense was great in that game. Fantastic, really. LSU was a top 5 offense in the SEC, and they held them to 14 points. So Ohio State's offense has been great for several weeks. And we've been skeptical because of the level of competition, but they have been. And the defense seems to be improving tremendously themselves. They didn't lose. I mean, Michigan State lost, but it was inevitable that Michigan State, Michigan, and Ohio State, only one of them can get through that 3-way gauntlet of games and not lose another game, right? Because Ohio State's going to play Michigan State and Michigan, and vice versa. Like somebody's going to lose. Only one team can go 2-0 in that set. In a lot of cases, it may be that they all trade losses. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's a weird year, and it's felt like a weird year. But we also have these games in November a lot, or a week in November where a lot of teams go down, and the sort of the pretender undefeateds lose, and a lot of other people struggle. I don't know. I'm hesitant to take too much from it. Let's keep on rolling on. We've got a million super chats, guys. We're not ignoring you. There's just way more than we can get to. A lot of you have been asking about Dan Mullen in Florida. I don't know more to say than what we had said here. Like Matt Menino, Penn State fan, and love you guys. What do you think Penn State being unranked despite Iowa, Wisconsin, and Auburn being ranked? I think you have a genuine complaint about at least some of that, right? Like Auburn being ranked and not Penn State, I think was really problematic.
Auburn might not be ranked anymore. I mean,
yeah, I don't think they will be.
Well, what do we say, Josh? We say this all the time. I said this to somebody this week who was complaining that Oregon was ranked behind Ohio State. Once you have a loss, head-to-head doesn't carry. Head-to-head might still carry, but once you have a loss, you lose control over being in an absolute position to be ranked ahead of that person. Utah beat Stanford 52-7. So Oregon losing to Stanford is really, really, really bad.
Well, Oregon is ahead of Ohio State, or was ahead of Ohio State, to clarify.
Well, but they weren't in like a lot. Like I think AP's got them ahead. I think that we've got Ohio State ahead. So yes, maybe in CFP, but in general, and this is the same thing with Penn State. So okay, not talking about Auburn losing today, but Penn State saying we should be ranked ahead of Auburn or we should be ranked ahead of Iowa. Well, you lost to Illinois, you lost to Iowa, like these, then you lost to Ohio State. So you have 3 losses. And Auburn, by definition, if you think Penn State is good, has a loss to a good team. And so that Illinois loss has to have some weight. You can't just go head to head, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. You can, and I've been the one sort of beating the drum preseason that I had doubts about Auburn. And you can look at Auburn and say, well, what has Auburn accomplished? The funny thing is, one of their biggest accomplishments was beating LSU 24-19. That was just 4 weeks ago, guys. That was in October, and that was kind of seen as a big turnaround win for them. Lose to Georgia, beat Arkansas, and then beat Ole Miss by 11. They had 2 losses. They lost to Penn State. They lost to Georgia. They won the rest of their games. They had ranked wins. Like you said, there's more wins and losses in play. If Penn State, 100%, you agree with this, right? Like if Penn State had not lost to Illinois, they absolutely would have been ranked ahead of Auburn. It was the equivalent almost of Auburn losing the Georgia State game that they almost lost.
Right.
And we've had this conversation with several teams nationally of the albatross. Mississippi State had an albatross, and there are a lot of people complaining about Mississippi State's ranking. I get the complaint. Now, the deal with them is they played 4 ranked teams, and they were 3-1 against those currently ranked teams. Nobody else could really say that. But, you know, I get where you'd want to make complaints, but I will also say when you get like anywhere after 15 in the current rankings, guys, it's hard. Like Pitt was 25th, and Pitt had a bad loss, but they also had have had a pretty good season. They've looked like a good team. They beat Clemson. I don't know if that matters for anything or not, but they've looked like a good team. And do you think Penn State's better than them? And if you want to cherry pick one team versus another, it can be really easy, especially if you want to focus on who has the worst loss, who has the most good wins, and you're not focusing on all the different factors. But usually that criteria you look to jump this one team doesn't work for to jump. You know, maybe you want to jump 19 because you think 19 has worse losses, but it doesn't actually work for 20th, 21st, and 22nd. You can't justify jumping them. It's just really freaking hard, guys.
Josh, I got the toughest one possible for you. Michigan State lost today to a not great team. Michigan is currently killing Indiana. What do you do there?
And see, this is where I would say I would rank Michigan ahead of Michigan State.
I would too.
I watched the 2 play. Michigan State won that game fair and square, head up. Totally buy that. But Michigan
they also
did
won
not
it
look
at home.
like
They won a close game at home.
Michigan looked absolutely like an evenly matched team. What in the world just came on ESPN? Is this like, I think this is competitive tag coming on after I am so confused. They changed what the UTEP game was, UTSA game, to a different channel. Did I change channels? The World Chase Tag Championship. I'm sorry. I was very confused. No, yeah, Michigan State. Not sure what you do with them. Let me touch on a couple other super chats. I'm trying to play catch up. Somebody asked about Minnesota and why were they ranked. Look, we talked about rankings and defending them. Minnesota was the one team you never saw either of us ever defend on Twitter because to be honest, that was the one I never got. I can't justify why Minnesota was ever ranked. I know their schedule was good, but they lost the games that were good, and they lost to Bowling Green, and they showed today that they're not a particularly good team.
Somebody asked, isn't Florida just Michigan? Not like their perennial power. Urban Meyer isn't there anymore. I don't know. Like Florida, to me, they had a tough stretch with McElwain, who I still think was a decent coach, but he couldn't recruit. Mullen can't recruit. Michigan seems like it's a brand that if you had a good coach there, could recruit really well. Maybe they are. Maybe these are 2 teams that are destined to just, until they get a really good coach and some really good momentum, are just going to fall short of their fans' expectations based on prior year's success. But I feel like Florida's had a little more recent hardware than Michigan that matters.
Okay, so I just flipped over to...
Are you going to talk more about tag?
No, I'm not going to talk more about tag. Flipped over to Louisville, Clemson. So Louisville, not that Clemson is that relevant, but I think they're interesting enough to most people. Louisville's down 6, minute 18 left. This is on ACC Network. And Cunningham just threw a pass right at a guy in bracket coverage, and the underneath defender let it go right through his hands, and the receiver caught it on like the 2-yard line with a minute left. So I think this is going to get over. They called it incomplete. I think it's going to get overturned. So that's another one. If you're channel hopping, that Louisville Clemson game is about to come down to a wire. Somebody Zext asked, isn't Florida just Michigan? Not like they're a perennial power, and Urban Meyer just isn't there anymore.
That's the one I just talked about.
Yeah, you can see how much attention I'm paying. I think it's a fair question, and I think the reality is that it's kind of. I mean, is it kind of accurate? The one thing I'll say that's different about Michigan and Florida in that analogy is where Florida sits from a recruiting perspective and the resources that are available to them as an administration. If they get a good coach in and they energize it at all, they can snap their fingers and have access to the most fertile recruiting ground in the country. Michigan just can't do that. Michigan does not, as a state, does not produce that many high-profile players, and that's why Michigan is a challenge combined with the academic situation. They have to recruit in Ohio and a lot of other states. So,
but counterpoint, we say that, but Florida State and Miami haven't been able to do it either. So, yes, there's a lot of talent there, but I don't know that with Georgia and Alabama and LSU dipping into that state, like, has their brand been treading water? These three brands been treading water for so long that it really doesn't matter that they share the state with all that talent. Is that a fair question to ask?
I mean, you're definitely getting to that point at the very least. Yeah, I don't know. At what point do you do so much damage to the brand? And the recruiting hasn't been good. It wasn't good under McElwain, and it hasn't been good under Mullen, and you can tell in that roster. A couple other super chats. Killtack9, y'all should. He's advocating for us doing the top 10 tomorrow because he doesn't think we'll be able to do it today. I'm not sure he's necessarily wrong. It's just a matter of time.
He's not wrong, but we got to do it today because we've found that our content is starting to compete with itself in terms of time. So if we don't get our top 10 video out early Sunday morning, then it's going to die the second we post a preview on Monday morning. So maybe towards the end of the year, we'll have time to do one and give it its own weight. But man, right now, I don't know that we have the ability to do that.
So somebody just put a really savvy comment in here. This is Moshe Clark. Purdue, assuming Purdue is ranked next week, which I think is a very good chance of happening given they're a 3-loss team. They played a hard schedule. They just beat a top 5 team and so many other teams lost. Ohio State is going to need to win 6 straight ranked games to win the national championship. Michigan State, Purdue, Michigan at Big Ten championship, semifinal, final, 6 straight. And it's almost certain, I think, if they drop any of the 6, they won't win the championship. That's freaking brutal. And I will say, as much as it's brutal, I'm giving it with the same fairness that we've given SEC schedules for years, because a lot of the Alabama, Georgias, and Auburns have had to run similar gauntlets at the end of their seasons because Auburn plays Alabama, Alabama plays Auburn, LSU plays Alabama, SEC championship. You got to give Ohio State credit if they win the title or if they make the final, that they do have just as difficult a sort of gauntlet as we've wanted to sort of excuse or talk about in those games.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, and this is where I'll give them credit because it's similar to what Alabama had in the middle of the year. And we've seen in the past, Georgia, not this year, but in the past with Georgia, it's not that Ohio State is going to play any one team that's better than them. They won't. They will not play a team better than them this year. It's that they're going to have to go through a lot of teams that are good enough to beat them. There's a difference there. There's a distinction there. When you play multiple teams in a row that are good enough to beat you, your odds of going undefeated in that stretch drop dramatically. And this is why we don't like G5s who consistently struggle but stay undefeated being considered for playoffs, because it's one thing to not be able to help your schedule and blow it out. And that if a G5 does that, I'm all for them being in the playoffs. It's another to compare beating Navy by 7, struggling with Tulane, struggling with Tulsa. If they had to go through a stretch like Ohio State's about to go through, where they play 6 ranked Power 5 teams who have Power 5 facilities, Power 5 coaches, Power 5 recruiting, and have these players that are on another level, and they have to play that gauntlet 6 times in a row. So let's take the playoffs out 4 games in a row on top of what's already been a harder schedule than what Cincinnati plays. We are not comparing apples and oranges at that point. And I don't think one last point I'll make about this before I turn it back to you. The Big Ten does their big teams no favors. Like, it's fun at the end of the year that Alabama and Auburn play, and I don't know who Georgia plays, but like there's a couple of big games in the SEC, but it's nothing like what the Big Ten stacks everything at the end. And I think it's dumb because you're going to have a team. It hasn't happened so much yet, but you're going to have a team that's going to lose who otherwise wouldn't have lost if they didn't have to have such a backloaded schedule. When you've got Ohio State going through a 4 or 5 game stretch of playing really lower rung Big Ten teams to have to finish with like Michigan State and Michigan, it's kind of ridiculous. And they need to do something to spread that out a little bit, because it's one thing to lose because the team's better than you. It's another to lose on a gotcha because you had to play a bunch of teams back to back to back.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, this is one of those things where when you're doing rankings or you're trying to talk about who should make the playoff, you can and you can't give credit to certain things. One of which is, in my view, injuries. If you lose a game as a one-off because your starting quarterback gets knocked out like in that game or late in the week prior, and you have a bad game, I think that like a one-off or short period is somewhat excusable. That's where Texas A&M is.
Clemson, Syracuse, a couple years ago too.
Yeah, where what was that, 2017? Where Bryant got hurt. But if you lose guys for the remainder of the season, you stop getting to use that as an excuse, because at some point, not just at some point, that's who your team is, right? You lost because Ole Miss is in that boat. Ole Miss got their ranking based off what they've done to this point, but if they lose games, and I think they're very apt to in the remainder of the year because of the injury situation they're in, that's not really an excuse anymore, because it's just who they're going to be. And scheduling is the same way. Like I will give you credit or excuses if your schedule has a lot of really highly ranked teams. But one thing that I've never personally felt like should be used as an excuse is if you scheduled really dumbly. If you put your bye week in week 2 and you have all your conference games like 9 weeks in a row, which is what the Big Ten does, you haven't played more tough games as a result of that. You just made your tough games harder to win.
Right.
And
right.
That's just self-imposed stupidity. I mean, that's just like, making it harder for yourself is not something that in my view, should ever necessarily be taken into account. And I get, like, if we want to talk about you play like 4 ranked teams because the conference is really good, and I think that's where Ohio State is going to be to a certain degree. I get that. But I also, they like to talk about, well, the SEC has it easy, or the ACC, or frankly, it's every other conference pretty much tries to mix in some minor games at this point in the year to break up this cycle. Look, anybody's allowed to do that. Like, the fact that you don't schedule it that way is self-inflicted. So I just don't personally view it as an excuse.
No. And look, Auburn did this. Somebody mentioned in the chat, and it's worth pointing out, because Auburn used to play, if I'm not mistaken, Alabama or Georgia and Alabama back to back, and they always had Texas A&M or somebody else floating around in November. So there was a chance they would play 3 top 10 teams in November, and they changed it because it was ridiculous. And I'm okay with that, because I don't want a team to lose based on scheduling sequence. I want a team to lose because they're not as good as the other team. And that's a place where, people call us SEC homers, but that's a place where a lot of SEC teams do get eaten up, ground up in the middle of their schedule, in the middle of their season. They try to alleviate that at the end of the year. And there's a lot of out of conference, in-state Power 5 tie-ins like Florida, Florida State, Kentucky, Louisville, those sorts of things that also necessitate end of year sort of juggling. Big Ten's got to figure this out, because they don't need to lose a national champion because they had someone lose a division because they lost a game at the end of the year, and it was at the end of a really rough stretch. All right, I've got to keep moving on some of these super chats and some of these points that people are making. Somebody said Alabama won't drop. Alabama won't drop with a close loss because the committee wants 2 SEC teams in. I think this is wrong on 2 accounts. One, we've seen the committee be willing to punish teams for bad wins. They did it with Oklahoma, they did it with Wake Forest, right? 2, Josh, isn't the last thing the committee wants is to have to put 2 SEC teams in, not only because they're going to get heat for being biased, but also they got to seed them, which is really tough too.
Yeah, it's like the conspiracy theory stuff. It doesn't baffle me, but it always does kind of annoy me, frankly. One, the committee is formed, guys. You realize this by people from every conference in equal measure, and I mean that in terms of it's Big 10 guys and Pac-12 guys and Big 12 guys. And when they seed teams, the representatives that are associated with that conference can't be in the room.
Right.
So this idea that the committee is bending over backwards to help the SEC is a super shallow, unfounded viewpoint of how they operate and what they do. I know ESPN does the show where they announce the rankings, but the fact that they do the show to announce the rankings doesn't mean they have, and in fact, they have no part in setting the rankings. I'm looking at right now, like, do you think guys from Arizona State, Rick George from Colorado, Charlie Cobb from Georgia State, do you think Rod West from Notre Dame or Tyrone Willingham from Stanford are, do you think Tyrone Willingham is bending over backwards to get 2 SEC teams in? Do you think he cares? No. Like that is
no, he just wants to hold up. He just wants to do this after every. Sorry.
Yeah, it's not a thing. Like people need to let go of that. If you want to talk about problems, it's maybe that the misconceptions of the strength of the SEC somehow influence the way they look at scheduling, and maybe there's an argument there. I'm not sure, but I this idea that they intentionally try to get a conference in or not, as far as I've ever seen, they make no effort to do so. And that's the one thing I really credit them for is they don't rank conferences, they rank teams, and that's the way it should be.
Which is and Josh, speak on this a little bit. This is where I get frustrated when people say we need auto bid playoff expansion with all Power Fives and the best G5. Like the best G5, first of all, might not even be in the top 25. Second of all, the G5 is not a conference.
Yeah. And I think that's the latter point is probably the most important. That look, it's not like the Pac-12 and the SEC are super buddy that they're trying to keep out the G5 right now, and that they have P5 meetings and G5 meetings. Like the P5 conferences don't get along either. There's not this great conspiracy.
No. No. Pac-12 hates the SEC.
Yeah. A couple other. Can I bring up a couple more super chats here? One, I want to just give recognition. Joker94 gave us a super chat just to thank us for all we do every week, and I really, really appreciate it. We're trying to stay on top of it. I know we didn't do as much content last week, but we've had our share of stuff come up.
Guys, last week it really, the stars aligned that there weren't a lot of great games to preview because I had work stuff, plus I have a 2, 4, and 6-year-old, so Halloween is fairly important to them. So that's all I'm going to say about that. And the Braves were kind of playing a little bit of baseball.
Yep. Stephen Light throwing out Michigan recruits every year, and as a Penn State fan, he sincerely hopes that they keep Harbaugh forever. I'm sure that had no amount of sarcasm or ill intent whatsoever about Michigan keeping Harbaugh. And then Edward, go ahead.
I think I will say before we get to Edward, because I love us some Edwards. I want to talk about his super chat too. This, to me, this year is the best job Harbaugh's done. I don't think he's got a great talent at quarterback. I think they have managed pretty well, and he's going to go 10-2. I think he's done a pretty good job this year, and I've been the first one, you as well, to kill the guy on this show. I think he's done a pretty good job this year.
Well, maybe there's some truth to this. Do you think the fact that Harbaugh's done a good job might be related to the fact that college football this year has not had the explosion of offenses, and that I don't know if it's that defenses or defensive coordinators have figured out the RPO. We've talked for a couple years things people were doing, and they seem to have taken hold nationally. Or I think a lot of it is just a bad year for quarterback play. But I think to some extent, Harbaugh's strategy, which is more ball control, leaning on the run game, is just a good year to have that approach. In the same way Georgia's leaned into it and it's been highly effective. I think it's just been sort of a melding of those two things into being the right idea, right place, right time.
Somebody said earlier that all offenses suck this year, which I think there's a lot of factors at play. We've talked about it all year. I think this is the kind of year where, to your point, a ball control defense first team can steal a championship, right? Like Michigan might steal a Big Ten championship. Like they might beat Ohio State. I don't think they will, but in this year where I think that for the first year in a while, defenses have kind of figured out the things that were really killing them for, like, namely the RPO spread. But I don't know that it's sustainable. I think that offenses will also adjust, and it seems like we get offenses really good for a long stretch and defenses dominating for a short stretch. So maybe that adds a sense of urgency for Michigan and for Georgia, that if you're going to make a move, this has got to be your year to do it, because at some point the needing to score 40 points in some game of significance is going to come back around.
Yeah. I tend to agree with it. Do you want to move on to Edward's comment? And I think we want to do the top 10, and I also want to make sure my chair almost just gave out on me. Because it's a hand-me-down from a charity sale, and it's broken. Do we want to?
You're not rocking your gamer chair that you bought?
No, it's actually my like real big boy work office. So we talk about Edward. I want to talk about Texas A&M and Auburn too before we get to the top 10, because that's a game we've barely touched on.
Sure. Edward said, "Hey guys, weird stretch for Ohio State. Ryan Day literally cherry picking plays that focus on their weaknesses." So this is something we've talked about in the past that Nick Saban does when they play Chattanooga or some directional school or Vanderbilt. I'm not sure Ryan Day is trying to stretch growth offensively in his team and crippling them with things they're not good at in one score ball games. As much as I want to agree with Edward because he's such a friend of the program, Josh, I'm not entirely sure you do that. Like, you do that against Maryland. You don't do that in a one score game against Nebraska, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with it. There are other things that were in play in that game that kind of made it what it was, and I'm trying to.
Nebraska's got a good defense. Like, that's part of it.
Yeah, I mean, Ohio State's had been in the position where they've been able to run the ball well enough to give them a ton of balance. They had 90 yards rushing, 4.5 yards per carry for Trevion Henderson, which is a lot less than he had been having. Stroud was 7.5 yards per attempt. It's easy to say the play calls made it what it is, but the truth, I think personally, is, like I talk about a lot, if you can handle the run and you can play man coverage, those RPO shot plays never get thrown because the guys aren't wide open like you're used to. Garrett Wilson's absence was a big deal in that game, and I think it's really clear that having high-level receivers is very important. But the bigger deal really is that Nebraska wasn't having to sacrifice stuff schematically to defend the run, and the shot plays weren't there. So at that point, like between the I say this way too much that I kind of hate bringing it up, but between the 20s, Ohio State hit some big plays for like 30 yards at a time. But as I was the one that put the tweet out to note, there's a problem that those plays are not turning into points, because when they start getting closer to the red zone and the RPO starts to go away because the field compresses, Stroud cannot run the offense in a more traditional offense. And some of it is on Ryan Day and his scheme. Some of it, a lot of it is really on the fact that they can't run the ball. That's how their improvement against the bad teams they played had a lot to do with the fact that they could run the ball highly effectively in the red zone to punch balls in to score. But when they've got to actually like throw, if a team's playing run and they're in short yardage, they don't have a lot of stuff they're comfortable doing, and that's really starting to show up. So at least that's my personal take on it. But I totally agree. I have never bought any argument that in a 1-score game, a coach is holding back. Coaches hold back when you've got like a 2-score lead, or they might hold back for the first or second quarter in a G5 game they know they're going to win. But once you get midway through the second quarter, they're going to try to put 2 to 3 score lead on there. And then maybe they, mess around when they got a 3-score lead where they're not trying to build it if they think the other team isn't a threat to score, but never in a 1-score game. They're always going to be trying to win a 1-score game.
Ty
and I think Edward may have been largely sarcastic. I want to give credit for it, but I'm just addressing that point.
Ty said that are we going to criticize Alabama as much as we are Ohio State? Ty did not catch the first half hour of this show where we absolutely crushed Alabama, and namely Bill O'Brien. So yeah, I think that it really boils down to the fact that this very much is a 2007 year. Save Georgia. Everybody in the top 10 could lose to anybody in the top 25 on any given week. And we've not seen that for a while. And I don't want people are saying in the chat, this is why we need to expand the playoffs. But this year is the exception, not the rule. We shouldn't be expanding the playoffs to cater to the exception when, if you look back to the last 5 years, if we had expanded playoffs, it would have just been bloodbaths, and it would not have been a good thing. So,
well, and I'm going to push back too. If our point is that everybody sucks, right? If that's our point, that these offenses are terrible, and then Alabama sucks, and then Ohio State sucks, and then Michigan State sucks, and then blah, blah, blah. Why does that make us want to put more teams in? I mean, isn't the conclusion that we're all drawing this year that there may not be anybody that can actually beat Georgia? Because I think the truth is people want to expand the playoff because they want someone to beat Georgia. They don't want an SEC team to win the playoff, and they know the only real chance for somebody to beat the SEC team that's going to win the playoff is if you put like 8 in there and hope for chaos. But it's the same problem I have for a lot of years. 2017 was the same way. The argument to expand the playoff based off 2017 was an argument that because there were only 3 teams that should have been in there, and we had to pick between a 4th and a 5th that really shouldn't, a 2-loss Ohio State with a bad loss, or Alabama that didn't win their division, that we should expand to like 8 so that we don't have to deal with deciding which team that shouldn't be in got in.
And then 8 or 9 is mad.
The argument for expansion should only be if there's no team period that clearly is really good, which is not a problem we have because of Georgia, or that there are 5, 6, 7, 8 teams in a given year that all look dominant, like undefeated Pac-12, undefeated Big 10, undefeated Big 12, undefeated ACC, and we leave out an undefeated P5, which never happens and is certainly not happening this year. So to me, it's kind of the exact opposite. I mean, and I think I know exactly where we're going to go here. This is the exact point you're making, right? About eliminating subjectivity by expansion. It doesn't do that.
No. And look, and for those that are listening on the podcast version, there's a comment that says expand the playoff to eliminate subjective selection committee. And this is the criticism that frequently is aimed at the committee in the playoff process, is that it's an invitational, it's subjectivity. But there's 2 things I want to note here. One, unless you're having an 130 team playoff, there is subjectivity. Like there just is. Like otherwise, you have to pick a field at some point because there's so many teams in D1 football. Number 2, if you think it's subjective, super subjective at the end of the year. Remember, we're working with impartial, we're working with partial data right now. At the end of the year, picking 4 is subjective. Has anyone tried to do a top 10? We do one every week, and I'm telling you, it is hard as hell. So if you think that 4 is subjective, 8, 12, or 16 is unbelievably subjective. How do you How do you pick between the 16th and 17th best team in the country to be in the playoffs? I don't know. And Josh, you made a great point, and I want to give you credit for it. What we're saying this year is everybody's bad. Georgia's the only elite team. So instead of them having to beat Ohio State and Alabama, or actually Alabama in the SEC championship, Ohio State in round one, and then some other top 5 team in round 2, we also need to see them beat Wake Forest before we do that. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. And I mean, to the subjectivity problem, right? Okay, you're still subjectively picking 8 instead of 4. And the only thing that you can say
harder.
is
more subjective.
Yeah, I mean, who's 7, 8, 9, and 10 is probably going to be a lot more difficult because, as people are seeing, when you get closer to 10, it's the same problem with UTSA not being ranked and Minnesota being ranked. The lower you get in the rankings, it gets really, really hard to figure out who should be ranked ahead of who. There's usually not a really great argument for it. But yeah, you're still making a subjective determination of who needs to be 8. It's just instead of 4, it's 8. It's still completely subjective. I think the argument people have there's twofold. One is, well, you've at least captured the teams that are good enough, which, again, our point is, I don't think there are 5 teams that are good enough. I think the problem is there's only one. And 2, people want to say, well, if you expand the playoff, it'll help parity. And this is a whole other discussion that we've ran it on so many times, but we can spend another 60 seconds on it because it's showing up in the chat. This idea that if Cincinnati and Texas San Antonio and Central Florida makes the playoff, that they will suddenly turn into a powerhouse is not founded in any historical reality. The teams that have been good in college football have always been good. You're not going to have a bunch of Florida State and Florida fans that are suddenly going to become huge UCF fans. A bunch of huge Ohio State fans are not going to suddenly become Cincinnati fans. They're not going to suddenly have this instant magical treasure chest of money that shows up to change all their facilities. They're going to, which will cost like $400 million. These are things that are really slow to change, and making the playoff one year is much more likely for you to just be number 8, lose to Georgia 60-0, and look like you don't belong than it is for you to suddenly start recruiting at some awesome level. Michigan State made the playoffs, and a few years later, they were having losing seasons. Like, it hasn't helped teams to be in that position.
I think especially for G5s, this is a salient point, and I want to touch on a couple of things here. It might get a little ranty. So one thing is this concept of the Pareto principle, where like the production of all good things or the best things are concentrated over time, are concentrated with a certain few select amount of people or producers. That doesn't mean it's the same people or producers every year over year. In the G5, to have the kind of benefit from being in the playoffs that it puts your program on another level, like you said, to win over Ohio State fans, to be Cincinnati fans, you got to be that thing for a decade, right? But in the G5, and this is why they always say the best G5, it's a different team every year, because what a G5 does is they have a lot of very senior laden team that comes through and everybody stays together, which is artificially a benefit that the P5, the good P5s don't have. And so you have a 2017 UCF that will be good for a year or two, and then they'll fall off because G5s just do that. So you even if you put them in the playoffs one year, it's not going to be a game changer for them because of the natural organic turnover they're going to have the next year or two. And they very well might be in the playoffs one year and then go 2-10 3 years later. The other thing, and Josh, I want you to talk about this because this is the thing that we've long said they need to do, which actually does help get a G5 in the playoffs. If you expand, no auto bids, 6 teams, early rounds on campus, early round 1 and 2 get by in round 1. Why don't you run with that for a little bit?
Yeah. One thing I think it would be great to see would be to see the playoff actually on campuses, just because it gives an advantage and it gets engagement. I don't think we'll ever see it. As much as we defend certain parts of the existing system, I will say the whole bowl system is kind of a cartel. There's a lot of interconnections there with how they're set up, and there's a lot of charities, and it's tied in with the academic institutions, and it's a cartel, and you're just not going to break it. But it would be nice to see. But the bigger thing is, to our point, we have doubts that if you put 2021, I don't care about, I know Cincinnati played Georgia in 2020. Georgia wasn't necessarily the same team they were in the regular season. They weren't a great team during that year. They're far better this year, different year. If you put Georgia and Cincinnati in round one, I don't know if it's going to be super competitive. But if you do a play-in game where they've got to play like Ohio State or, somebody, like let's say Oklahoma, I have a lot more confidence that the playoff is at least going to have really more competitive games, right? And I actually, if you talk 8 teams or 12, I've often said I prefer 12 to 8. And the reason, from my perspective, is that I want to see the playoff be competitive. I want to see the playoff have good games between teams that are just at least at some level evenly matched. And with 12, because you have a play-in game, you're trying to determine who gets the 5, 6, 7, and 8 slot. And so if I see 5 play 12, and then, I'm doing that right? 5 plays 12, and then 6 plays 11, 7 plays 10, and 8 plays 9. Yeah. There's going to be a number of competitive games there, 8 and 9, 10 and 11, even, like 7 and 12, a lot of years could be competitive. You might get some like 2-loss Alabamas are going to get in a lot. 2019 Alabama is probably the best example, but that is what it is. But at least those games will be competitive. If you do 1v8, like right now, that would be Georgia v. Wake Forest would have been last week, right? 1v8 is going to be a bloodbath a lot because the teams in the top 3 or 4 can be really, really, really good. And so number 1 versus number 8, number 2 versus number 7, number 3, you maybe get 1 or 2 decent games in the first round. So I've always thought a play-in game, because you play teams closer to you in the ranking, right? Rather than playing 1v6, you play 3v6 to open it, is likely to produce a much more competitive playoff slate.
And Josh, I do want to get to Braden's super chat about Texas A&M and Auburn, but isn't this true? Like, if we had expansion this year, if Alabama lost to Georgia in the SEC championship, or if Alabama lost tonight, the odds are, with a month to rest and prepare, it's far more likely that Alabama rallies and wins the playoffs than does a UTSA or some Wake or some Cinderella story. Like, isn't that the reality? And isn't that what we're trying to avoid? Because we want those 2 losses that Alabama took to matter.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. The love it or hate it, something the BCS system did is it punished you so much for losing a game that if you were undefeated Notre Dame, like let's say it was like 2018, right? Alabama was 1, Clemson was 2, Notre Dame was 3, Oklahoma was 4. Alabama was essentially punished for being number 1, and they had to play Oklahoma. Or maybe it was Notre Dame was 2 and Clemson was 3. I'm forgetting. I'm getting confused. But there are plenty of years in the BCS, point being, where a great team loses a game or 2 and another team goes undefeated, and we rewarded that, put them in the national championship because a screw up put you out. It kind of shook things up a little bit. The more you excuse losses, the more the best quality teams are going to stay in that like top 8 range. Because even if they have a bad year and screw up, they still float around the top 8 because they're only going to do it once or twice. Alabama played like crap and beat LSU today because they're just a lot more talented than LSU right now, frankly. They were able to lean on their defense. Hadn't even been that great to beat LSU. That's just because of where they're at. And even if they lost the game, maybe with 2 losses, they can still get in there with like a top 10 or 12. If you want other teams to get in, the thing you want to reward is like Michigan State or Michigan if they run the table. And you don't want them to have to play Ohio State that they've just beaten, or Alabama that should already be out, or et cetera. I think that gives the advantage to the elite teams.
All right, circling back on Braden's super chat, he said that Auburn's not going to win another game this year. And look, Auburn fans are frustrated today because a lot of them thought that they would go into College Station and get a win. We've been very high on A&M, particularly that defense, for a while. And Elko's got them playing great. I don't look, that game unraveled late, and Auburn's offense was not good today. I don't think that any Auburn fan, one, should be that upset about the loss today, and two, no Auburn fan should take that to think that they're going to lose to South Carolina in 2 weeks. They're not. Auburn is a better team than South Carolina. They're going to go 1-1 probably against Miss State and Alabama. They're looking at an 8-4 season this year probably, and maybe a 9-4 with a bowl. I think that's completely respectable given the transition they've had, the turnover they had on their roster, starting a whole new coaching staff this year. I don't think that so far, even with the loss today, Auburn's season has been totally respectable in my opinion. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I've been highly impressed with the job that Brian Harsin did with that roster. Frankly, if you look at the recruiting rankings, it's pretty concerning long term. That's a whole other discussion. But in terms of what they did this year, they started out a team that wasn't particularly good. They lost to Penn State, sure, but the next week they almost lose to Georgia State. That's just the team that Brian Harsin inherited. They weren't really settled at receiver, at quarterback, at running back. Even they didn't really know who they had behind Bigsby. They found a guy in Jacquez Hunter. They've kind of gotten the receiver rotation figured out well enough where they're decently good at it. They've made Bo Nix play better than he's played at any point in his career. And the defense, which hasn't been as good, they lost 2 transfer defensive tackles to Florida, has turned out to be a pretty good unit. So they've done really, really well to be in the position they're in. I thought this might be like a 5 or 6 loss Auburn team. They are way down this year. It is absolutely a rebuilding year. And they've got a new coaching staff that's having to figure it out. And they've, I think, done an admirable job. A&M, and I saw like a million comments on this about transitive property stuff with A&M and the Colorado game. Look, they're in a game, and in the first quarter, the starting quarterback breaks his leg. That
First year starting quarterback.
Yeah, and then they lose multiple offensive linemen, which a lot of people also miss. I think it was like 3 offensive linemen had to be rotated out at one point due to injury. And that tanks a lot of offenses. It just does. They are not the same team by any means that lost to Colorado. Were they phenomenal offensively against Auburn? No, but Auburn's got a good defense, first off. And 2, as much as not phenomenal they were a lot better than they were against Colorado and Arkansas and Mississippi State. But to the other point of this, a lot of people were questioning Mississippi State being in the top 25. A lot of people are going to point to the fact that they just lost the game against Arkansas. That was a tough matchup for Mississippi State, but Mississippi State is generally been a really good run defense. They're a pass-first offense. I do think there is reason to be concerned about the fact that Auburn may lose to Mississippi State and Alabama, which would actually make them 7-5, which is not a great record. But I'm with you. The South Carolina blowing out Florida, I'm not going to take anything from that other than the fact that Florida's in implosion mode. But I do not expect Auburn to lose to South Carolina. That is a bad football team. But I do think don't just write off Mississippi State either, though, because they lost to an Arkansas team that was a particularly kind of tough matchup for how they want to play. Particularly on the way Arkansas plays defenses, and their zone coverage scheme is really, really hard for the air raid scheme that Leach runs at Mississippi State.
People still want to talk playoffs. We got to circle back on a couple of super chats. Biscuit says the FCS championship game will be more competitive and entertaining than the playoff championship game this year, which, look, that might be the case. I think that I think even this year, and even with Georgia being out in front of everybody, a 4-team playoff will have teams who are, if they're fully rested and aren't ravaged with injury, could beat anybody on any given day. So I'm not entirely sure about that. And then I'll let you handle this one. A Pucumber said, I looked at the top 8 rankings for the past 20 years, and for the final week before the bowl week, this pretty much guarantees Ohio State makes playoffs. Yes. Josh, take this. We touched on it a little bit. Take it again real quickly. Ohio State and Alabama are in every year, which kind of, in a circular way, props up their program and doesn't give them the chance to slide.
Yeah, this has kind of happened in the FCS, right? Like North Dakota State has been on their runs. I think there was a point where Appalachian State did it. They actually were not always number 1 going into the playoffs, but they get to play their entire season. They truly get to play their entire season as just a slate to make sure you don't lose more than 2 games and build a playoff team. Like it changes the calculus dramatically, and they're going to end up in the playoffs almost every year, especially because those elite teams, they're not going to have more than a couple screw ups. And nobody in college football, this whole nobody's played anybody, nobody in college football plays that many ranked teams. 5 is a ton in a season before postseason seeding, right? Like up to the conference championship games, 5 would be a ton in a regular season. Most teams play about 3. So if you can go 1-2 or 2-1 and go 2-1 versus ranked teams, drop another stupid one, you still get in as Alabama and Ohio State, especially since you're probably still in the race for the conference championship. It's just really hard to keep them out that way.
So Kiltack said he hasn't watched enough A&M, but is it possible they were holding off the playbook till Alabama? I don't know that's. I mean, partially, I'm sure that's true, not intentionally for Alabama, just limiting the playbook because they had to put a backup quarterback in spot duty in two games before Alabama, and you don't want to get super complicated with a playbook with a guy that hasn't been getting first team reps. And I think that this is important to talk about, or to understand. When I mentioned earlier, when you were talking about Haynes King, he was a first-year starter. First-year starters, when they're coming in camp, are getting a lot more first-team reps, a lot more attention than say a year ago when Kellen Mond didn't need every single rep and every single bit of attention from the coaching staff. So it was even harder. Calzado was even further behind coming into that game, or coming into this getting thrown in the fire. That's why I don't put too much weight in the Colorado game. But I'll also say today, Josh, offense didn't look great. So there's still some issues there, but they're certainly better than they were against Colorado.
Yeah, no, there's definitely still issues there, but they are a lot better than they are against Colorado. The thing that I think people have missed is that the defense has actually improved a lot, which is something that hasn't been discussed. They've got a freshman, Chappell, that was big for them against Auburn, that has come on strong. And that was a team that was supposed to be led by having one of the top defenses in the country. And they weren't a very efficient defense early in the year. And they have come on strong. But that does bring up in complications in all these discussions, right? Alabama did actually move the ball quite well on that Texas A&M defense. It wouldn't shock me, given the fact that Jimbo Fisher made comments guaranteeing that they'd beat Alabama, that they might have actually held some wrinkles back for that game or had it circled majorly on the calendar. But I still think it's not necessarily a great loss. But I want to make this point. And I said this might be coming at the time, and people gave me crap because that's what always happens. It is extremely likely that Texas A&M will end the year as the highest ranked team on Alabama's schedule. Extremely likely. Now that they beat Auburn.
We got a lot of unranked loss stuff this week regarding Alabama, which we've already talked about how ridiculous that is.
Yeah, I personally think, and this is sort of the nature of media narratives, right? This was the year that Alabama suffered their first unranked loss. The truth of the matter is, and everybody's doing it in the comments still, people just grossly overreacted to how bad Texas A&M was right after they lost their starting quarterback and multiple offensive linemen. That was not a bad football team. It's a very good football team. And they're going to probably end up, as much as people hate it, I think it's because there's so many Texas and Oklahoma fans on top of SEC fans that have hatred for A&M. They don't want to hear it. Texas A&M is probably a real top 10 team this year, like legitimate top 10 team. The unranked loss stuff is just basically just a misranking. They are not any worse than the top 10 quality team overall in the country. They're just not. They beat Penn State's not ranked. Maybe they'll be ranked this week. I think Penn State and Auburn are about even, and A&M handled them pretty darn well, especially on the defensive side of the ball. So people just need to accept it. They're not going to, but you just need to accept it.
And people also need to accept the fact that, like you talked about on Twitter earlier this week,
real quick,
these rankings, go ahead.
I was just going to say, this LSU near loss is way worse in my mind than the actual loss to A&M in terms of my projection for Alabama and how good they are and their chance against Georgia. I take way more negative from this near loss than I did the A&M actual loss, because A&M's a lot better than LSU.
Yep.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, like, people freaked out about the first ranking in the college football playoffs, but the committee does it right. They don't assume wins in the future. They give you credit for wins after you get them. And so, everybody wanted the other thing about the Mississippi State win for Alabama, everybody wants to say Mississippi State shouldn't be ranked. Okay, let's say that they're on the fringe of top 25. How many teams have a 40-point win over a top 30 team? Because Alabama beat them on the road 49-9. I care about margin of victory. Everybody's eyeballs for their team cares about margin of victory. For the teams they don't like, they don't care. I care that Georgia beat Kentucky 30-7. I care that they beat Auburn 34-10. That stuff matters to me, right? Ohio State blowing out Indiana and Maryland matters to me, even though those aren't good teams. So we need to get off that a little bit. Anyway, we got a super chat that takes us in a different direction, and I'm kind of glad about it because we've been talking so much about the playoffs and rankings and stuff. Does Texas have a good coaching staff with a bad football team, or is it bad all around? I didn't see it going this bad. First years are tough. Nick Saban lost to La Monroe in 2007. I think Sark is a great coach. I think he's got good pedigree. He's been exposed to so much at so many levels. I think he's got to get not just he's got to get his staff right because it's going to take a little bit of trial and error, but he's also got to get his personnel right and get buy-in. And you even talked about how a lot of these guys walking off the bus look like Tarzan, but they get on the field and they play like Jane. And that's a carryover from the Herman era.
Yeah, there are a lot of bad evaluations on that roster, and you've got like you kind of hate to hate on kids, but guys like PJ Foster at safety, big, physical, great looking guys, and they're not fantastic football players. And I think you've got to blame Herman, and then before him, the end of the Mac Brown era. There are a lot of bad evaluations where they took guys with the best measurables. They took a lot of commitments way too early before they really saw what they looked like them as the senior year. And Bijan Robinson is an absolute dude, but there's not a complete roster of players. And one of the big things I'll say for Texas is they're getting enough out of the quarterback position, but they're not getting great production. And they really don't have a complete set of skill talent on offense is one of my big complaints. Like they've got these great jumbo athletes they can do certain things with, but if you can deal with those things or even bend your defense to deal with those things and you can handle it, there's not really a counterpunch. Like they don't have great deep threats. It's Xavier Worthy's the transfer from Michigan, right? That's been doing well for them. I don't know that Xavier Worthy is the greatest receiver of all time, but because of how kind of desperate they are to like build a receiving core, Xavier Worthy and Joshua Moore end up being your studs. They need a lot of guys to fill a lot of positions. They need to be a lot more competitive at a lot of positions. And then the defensive side of the ball, there's just a lot of bad evals all around. It's not, I don't care what the recruiting rankings are. It's not a particularly talented roster in truth.
People are saying that Sark has bad pedigree, but my point about pedigree is he spent time 2 stints under Nick Saban. I'm guessing that Nick Saban is considered a pretty decent coach, and there's probably a thing or two that somebody might learn from him. I don't know. Maybe guys come coach for Nick Saban and are terrible after, or maybe he has a reputation for maybe improving their career after that. He also spent some time in the NFL.
Isn't there this thing right now where all the top teams in the country, pretty much like all but Oklahoma, are Nick Saban coaches? So it does sort of suggest that he does a decent job of teaching people how to run a program.
This notion that first of all, Sark at Alabama probably had the best offensive coordinator year I've ever seen. Like as a pure offensive coach, it was amazing. Secondly, he did not have a terrible stint at Washington. He did not have a terrible stint at USC. He had some demons that he had to sort out that impacted his ability to coach. But then it seems like he sorted those demons out. And I just don't agree with the notion that you spend that much time with Nick Saban. He rehires you and you're a coach that didn't pick anything up in those 2 stints. I don't believe it. I think people want to think that Texas will always be bad, but I just disagree. I'm long on Sark. Maybe other people disagree.
Yeah, I don't have a lot more to say to it. There are plenty of coaches that have not been great in their first year for a variety of reasons. So let's hold back
hammer
on
out a
that.
top 10. It's gonna get pretty late for you pretty fast. So
Yeah,
generally we've already done one by now. Do you have one kind of a skeleton of one?
yeah, and I'll own something without oversharing, but I've been dealing with a medical issue, so I'm kind of the past couple weeks. If you guys haven't been able to tell that I've been more tired, so that's been half our problems. But that's the one time I'll mention it. I have one handed out, and I was about to send it to you, so I will now. And the truth is, and I talked about this early, as much as it seems like this would be an awfully hard week to do the top 10, guys, it's really not. You know why? Stuff doesn't move from last week. My top 10 is going to look almost exactly the same in a lot of respects with a couple movements because the teams teams struggled really bad and looked really bad, but you know what? The team right behind them also looked really bad, and the team behind them looked really bad.
And then somebody
and
lost,
nobody
so
looked
it's academic.
and nobody behind them looked good enough to jump them. And there's just a couple teams that lost. So, you know, I sent it to you, but we'll walk through it. This week's top 10 is actually a lot like last week's top 10, and it's almost sort of setting in a holding pattern for the major games to come.
I've been going first, but why don't you go first this time?
Sure. So my number one, it should shock nobody, is Georgia. Georgia offensively is still a highly efficient offense with Stetson Bennett. He had a deep ball. Defensively, it's hard to comment much more. They lose. Maybe some people thought their best player on the edge due to legal trouble didn't skip a beat because of it. Run game and the passing games together. The one thing I'll say to Daniel's point, JT Daniels came into that game, and I don't know if it's injury or rust, but he didn't look great. So this idea that there's this other offense waiting in the wings, I've been skeptical because it's like week 10 and we haven't seen it yet, and I don't think it exists. I think that is what Georgia is, and I think Smart knows that that is more than enough to win the national title this year, given the rest of the slate. And that rest of the slate, to me, starts with number 2, and people are going to be mad, but tell me why you should jump them, is Alabama. I thought that game against LSU was a disaster. The offensive line looked atrocious. And if they were to play, let's say, Ohio State today, Alabama probably would have lost to Ohio State. Maybe could have lost to Cincinnati. Oklahoma would have lost to like Texas A&M. I think this was a much worse game than they played against Texas A&M. But this was the worst game they played. And I'm not sure in a week's time, when they figure out what to do with the offensive line with your injury situation they had early in the game today, that they aren't a better team. And there have been plenty of weeks where Alabama looked like they would have beaten anybody else in the country. So I can't justify dropping them, especially given that Ohio State, my number 3, didn't look a whole lot better against Nebraska. Now, they looked less incompetent, but their offense is still very sputtery. They still leave a lot of yards that they don't convert into points. This defense still has significant lapses, and that was not, I don't care what people say, is not a great Nebraska team. They are pretty good defensively. They're not elite, but offensively, they're not great. And they've had close wins because a lot of teams they've played have been in struggle mode, like Oklahoma. And because of the struggle mode, moving on to my number 4 pick and my number 5 pick. Number 4 for me is Cincinnati. Number 5 is Oklahoma. Rounding out the undefeated list here, Cincinnati did not look great today, even though they won. And this is now 3 games in a row, Navy, Tulane, and Tulsa, where they've been close games. I know Tulane was 31-12, but that was very close into the fourth quarter. Cincinnati is not putting away low-tier competition. Tulsa fumbled the ball diving for the goal line, or would have had a chance to tie that game. I have to have them there because they're undefeated, because I think the defense is very good and because of where everyone else is. And I think they're a good team. Showed early in the year. But how they're playing right now for the past few weeks, they would lose, I think, to someone like Texas A&M or Michigan or Oregon on a regular basis. Oklahoma is on bye. Not going to spend much time with them. The Kansas game is just 2 games ago. I want to see them play some, all their ranked teams are at the end of their schedule. Every single ranked team they play. I need to see how that ends for them. My number 6 is Texas A&M. Texas A&M soundly beat Auburn, and it took a long time to get there, but that is a very good defense. That is an offense that has a good run game. Playing an Auburn defense, it is a very, very good defense, I'll note, and it's very good against the run. They were able to get points on the board, able to put it away, and I don't know a whole lot of other teams playing better football right now. And you compare them to my number 7, Michigan. I think Texas A&M is a good notch or two better defensively than Michigan, even though Michigan's good. They're not as good as A&M right now. Michigan might be better offensively. They're really similar in a lot of ways. Michigan has limitations at quarterback. Michigan is very dependent upon Corum and a couple of skill players to make basically their whole offense, just like Texas A&M is. I think Texas A&M is just a better version of those things right now. I know Texas A&M has their 2 losses. They have the win over Alabama. Michigan right now doesn't really have anything on their resume. I think Wisconsin is the only team with a winning record that Michigan's actually beaten. So it's hard for me to rank them much higher than they are. Oregon is my number 8. They had a narrow win against Washington. Look, I don't love Oregon. Okay. I just don't love Oregon. They continue to struggle off and on. They struggled for a lot of the game against Washington. They scored a cheap touchdown late in the game. I think kind of playing for style points. It's hard to take that any other way. But good defense, good run game. They've had some guys out, but still decently sound. Anthony Brown, I don't think is a very good quarterback for this level of competition, but he's enough to get the job done. And with their defense, they can beat a lot of the middling teams, because at this point, we're starting to deal with teams that aren't great. And to that point, number 9, it's Notre Dame. Notre Dame, I don't know that Notre Dame on an average, if they play their average B game and they play like Ohio State and they have their average B game, that Notre Dame can stay on the field. Even though those Alabama, Ohio State, Cincinnati's, Oklahomas don't look that consistently great, Notre Dame is just a solid team that can beat a USC or a North Carolina or a Virginia Tech on a consistent basis by like 10 points. And right now, that's enough to get you 9th in the country in my list. And I think it's a real testament to what Brian Kelly does. And I know maybe Daniel will talk about it. We think Kelly's a fantastic coach, that he's able to produce these teams with, and produce these records despite the fact that Notre Dame is not an overwhelmingly talented team this year. And my 10th place team is Michigan State. You still got to get credit for beating Michigan. I picked Purdue outright in a podcast I was on for Kelly Ford Ratings. Picked them to beat Michigan State. It was a terrible matchup for Michigan State. Purdue only throws the ball. Michigan State is a straight up bad back 7. But when you look at the rest of the country, I just don't know who I'd put ahead of them. Maybe Ole Miss, but we're at the point now where I think Ole Miss is just a shell of a team. So that's my top 10. I've spent enough time talking about it. Turn it over to Daniel.
Yeah, and I'll note that there's a lot of people in the comments that are killing you for, like someone said, Alabama struggled with LSU today, but Texas Tech has a similar record and Oklahoma beat them really bad. Oklahoma barely beat Kansas. Y'all, that is such a non-starter for me. The fact that Oklahoma fans do not have the appreciation for what happened against Kansas, Tulane, who is now 1-8, like, this is beyond comprehension for me. That's like, you just forget that happened, that you needed a miracle play on 4th and 1 to not give Kansas the ball with a chance to win with 3 minutes left in the game. Yeah, Kansas is terrible. Texas Tech, before you go, Josh, Texas Tech, they didn't play an out-of-conference Power 5 team, right? Their 2 Power 5 wins were a 3-point win over West Virginia and a win over Kansas. That's it. They beat Houston, SFA, and FIU. So Texas Tech is not in the same universe as even a banged-up LSU. Please stop with that. I hate that I have to defend Alabama on a night when they look like trash, and I don't think they deserve any defense. But can we go back 2 weeks where you almost lost to Kansas, who is really bad?
Texas Tech gave up 70 points to Texas. 70 points. People are going to – we talked about this early in our show, and I'm going to flip it back to you. But look, guys, don't just say, like, X team shouldn't be here, Y team shouldn't be there, and certainly don't do the game you're playing there where you're saying, oh, let me compare. LSU is by far Alabama's worst game of the year this week, and they deserve to be criticized for it. but it was their worst game of the year. They still won, and LSU is still a team that would beat Texas Tech by 3 or 4 touchdowns.
Yeah, and that's
So
my thing is just like you said, like it's not just Alabama in a vacuum. Alabama looked terrible tonight. Awful. But Nebraska is 3-7 and played really a one-score game against Ohio State, right? Like Wake Forest lost. Michigan State lost. Like, so we talk about how, like, if you played a bad game against Kansas, had you been playing a team with a pulse that day, you would have lost, right? Well, now you're doing that for Alabama in a win against LSU, and I think it's laughable. That's where we are. All right, here's my top 10. Sorry, that was my rant. Georgia number 1. I have Ohio State number 2. I just said, they struggled against Nebraska. They looked bad against Nebraska. And I'll be honest, Nebraska's 3-7, but Nebraska does have a good defense. That was a road game. I'm not going to kill them too much. And I think that even though I don't love the inefficient scoring, they had their act together more than Alabama. Now, with Alabama, they already were struggling with injuries in the offensive line and having to shuffle pieces. When you lose your center, there's a lot that can go haywire, and I think that affected them a lot tonight, but I am dropping them a spot, swapping them with Ohio State right now. I think if those two teams played tonight, Alabama would have lost. I think that if they played last week, Alabama might have won, but this is this week, not last week. I've moved Oklahoma up from unranked to number 4, and that is a lot to do with the fact that everybody else looked really bad. And I think this notion that we should reward Cincinnati, who I have number 5, and ignore the fact that they've had a 3-game stretch of Navy, 1-7 or 1-8 Tulane with their third string quarterback, in Tulsa. Those 3 games, Navy, Tulane, and Tulsa, all losing records. They couldn't separate themselves from any one of those 3 teams. Imagine if they had a stretch like Ohio State has coming up or Alabama had early in the year. There's no way they're undefeated, but they are undefeated, so I have number 5. Number 6, I have Oregon. People are killing Oregon right now because Washington lost to Montana State to start the year. Washington, Oregon, if you're gonna give Ohio State credit for Penn State getting up for them because it's a rivalry game, even though Penn State isn't great this year, Washington, Oregon, if y'all don't follow Pac-12 football, that is a rivalry game. Those two fan bases hate each other. Those two teams get up for one another. Washington has a good defense. I'm not killing Oregon too much for winning a close game against Washington. Number 7, I have Texas A&M. They had a 3 or 17-point win today over a ranked team. It's a bigger win spread than Penn State did against Auburn. Auburn has shown to have a pulse this year. I think that's a quality win for them. I have number 8, Notre Dame. And everybody's forgotten about Notre Dame. But what did they do today? They won like 34-7 against the Navy team that only lost by 7 points to Cincinnati. If Notre Dame didn't lose that game to Cincinnati, they would be in the top 4 right now. Full stop. I don't love their schedule, but everybody else has all these warts. So does Notre Dame, but Notre Dame's been winning. Like Michigan State didn't win today. Wake Forest didn't win today. So I got Notre Dame there. This is where people are going to get super mad because of head-to-head. I've got Michigan number 9, Michigan State number 10. 2 things. 1, by definition, Michigan's loss is better than Michigan State's. By definition. Michigan lost to a higher-ranked team. 2, Michigan lost an incredibly close game on the road to Michigan State. That game on a neutral field, based on how Vegas does everything, Michigan probably wins that game. So I've got Michigan number 8, Michigan State, or number 9, Michigan State number 10. Y'all can kill me because you love head-to-head. But Purdue is not a great loss, especially I think it was a double-digit loss. They were never in that game, really. Purdue's not a great loss for the number 3 team in the country. That's my top 10. Josh, tell me what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're pretty closely aligned. The truth of the matter is it's really hard right now to do, especially the back half of the top 10. And the other thing I'll say is, particularly in the Big 12 and the Big 10, you've got a round robin between the top teams, right? Baylor, Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, or Michigan State, Michigan, and Ohio State, and particularly in the Big Ten, those games playing themselves out are really going to determine what the top 10 looks like. And to a certain degree, we're kind of estimating on quality and we're estimating on resume because none of these teams can really fill out the resume until they finish the back end of their schedule. The one thing that does seem really clear, given the wins and losses, is that if you win out, most everybody on this list, if you win out, you're in good shape. The exception to that really is Texas A&M, because the fact that they lost those two games and because Alabama and Georgia are both in the SEC, they're in, obviously if Alabama wins out, Texas A&M's just kind of sunk unless they get help. But otherwise, Cincinnati can easily sneak into the playoffs this year. There's a pretty good potential for Oklahoma, Ohio State, Michigan, all these teams to knock themselves out. So everything's definitely up on the table. I think it's interesting to talk about. I think the point of the sport is entertainment, and we should be willing to talk about it. But at the same time, 2 points as always. One, this is for fun. We're trying to rank the top 10 teams. We're very aware of the fact that we don't know enough to really rank them. And the fun thing is we are going to find that out in the next few weeks, which is nice. And we're not going to have to be totally hypothetical here. We're going to see a lot more data points that's going to help us be considered. And two, for all you people that wanted to hate it or criticize it, tell me all the teams that should be ahead of these top 10 teams. Because the truth is, everybody looked like garbage today. And stop talking about how, I don't know who you want to point to, right? Like Ohio State versus Nebraska, or if you want to talk about, Cincinnati today and their close win, which we did some. Those have been off and on, but it's one game, and they've had a lot of other games where they look dominant. Alabama in particular, this was their worst game of the season, and we'll see if their offensive line fixes itself, but I'm by no means ready to define them by their worst game of the season.
Well, and Josh, somebody said Notre Dame is not a top 10 team. And it's like, okay, but right behind them is like, who else are we going to put there? Wake lost to an unranked team. BYU's got 2 losses and they beat up on Idaho State today. West Virginia is 4-5. That was Oklahoma State's loss. Like, I feel like Notre Dame has been out of sight, out of mind because they've been playing good brand names that aren't ranked teams, but they're doing things that a lot of people aren't doing, and that's winning. And if intellectually we are going to put, and maybe this says something, and maybe you can touch on this, like we want to put Cincinnati in the top 5, right? We want to put them in the playoffs. We want to say they're a playoff team, but went wire to wire with Notre Dame, and Notre Dame's not a top 10 team. Doesn't that say more bad about Cincinnati than it does anything else about Notre Dame?
Yeah, I think so. Look, the reality is, if you look at the top 25 rankings, at least in my view, the 2 teams you could really consider for it are Ole Miss and Oklahoma State. Ole Miss right now is not a fantastic team. They beat Liberty by 13. Liberty's a reasonably good team. I mean, they're not really a top 25 team, but they're competent. But Ole Miss is a shell of a team. They've got 2 losses. They did lose to Auburn, and I can't put them that high. And then Oklahoma State, Oklahoma State probably has the next best argument, and I just don't necessarily love them as a football team. So for me, it's Notre Dame, Michigan State, or Oklahoma State. I'm not sure Oklahoma State really has a better argument than Notre Dame does, but that's your comparison. Some people might want to put UTSA, but again, I need to see them actually play any top 70 team. I'm not talking like top half of P5. I mean top 70 team.
And 2 weeks ago, people were ready to put SMU up there because they just want a G5 to be good, better than they are. I mean, look, UTSA, the best win they have is either a 7-point win over Illinois, or, well, that's it. That's their best win. But they have a 1-score win over UNLV, a 1-score win over Western Kentucky. I just can't imagine. They beat MTSU 27-13, Memphis 31-28. Like, I can't imagine a team that has now 4 struggle wins against borderline terrible teams, bad G5s, not bad teams, bad G5s. We're going to put them in the top 10 just because they got a clean record. No, thank you. No, thank you. I'm happy putting Cincinnati in the top 10 because they've played 2 Power Fives and they have dominated a lot of teams. Um, I, I mean, I don't know what to take from a dominating UTEP tonight. It's tough for me. I'm also getting tired. Josh, I got 5 minutes left. I know it's a little abrupt, but 5 minutes left. Do you want to start a thread on a topic that we can talk about for 5 minutes before we shut it down and go to sleep?
Sure. And I'm trying to look through the topics. And if somebody has something you want us to touch on in closing, feel free to ask a question. Personally, I think the most interesting thing going forward in college football is just seeing how these ranked teams play out in the next few weeks, because we're running out of time. We're about a month away from conference championships, right? Teams need to round into form if they're going to round into form. And I've heard far too many conversations from all these teams about how they're going to become something that they haven't been or they're not. And even teams like Oklahoma or Ohio State, where we had criticisms, and the criticisms being things we saw as being issues, those things that got fixed against certain teams rear their ugly head against Nebraska, against Kansas. And so I don't think those issues have gone away. I do think there's got to be something to the fact that defenses are starting to figure out how to handle the RPO. I do think at least as important, if not more important, is that this year is a significant reset on skill position talent on the offensive side of the ball. The offenses just aren't as good. The defenses, because of super seniors, are more veteran. But you only got a few weeks now for teams to figure stuff out. And this even goes for Georgia with their offensive side of the ball. And if that doesn't happen, then it just feels like the playoff is a foregone conclusion.
Somebody is questioning or wanting Pete Golding to be fired again. Look, Alabama's defense saved Alabama's ass tonight. 14 points. And to me, like 7 of those 14 points came off of the fact that LSU was losing by 2 scores and was getting 3 yards of play on that drive, which is incredibly hard to stop when they're going for it every 4th down, knowing that they've already lost. Like they're approaching this with nothing to lose. They're going for it on every 4th down. They weren't even getting chunk plays or abusing the defense. They were getting 3 yards at a time. Max Johnson was rolling out, getting a few here, running up the middle, get a few there. To hold that team to 14 points is they just scored 49 on Florida 2 weeks ago, which I know may not be that big a deal now, but like Georgia didn't score 49 on Florida 1 week ago. So I keep riding the fence of saying Pete Golding's terrible because of the bust that Alabama's defense has, and then Pete Golding's not terrible because it's the modern era of offenses, and giving up 14 points is something to be amazing. Somebody said Troy, who's been just killing it in the comments tonight. I want to give Troy his or her due. Josh, this is in relation to us saying, why do people want UTSA in there? Why is it with these G5s? Isn't this really the crux of it? It's the underdog factor. Everyone loves to root for the underdog. We overlook so much about them just to convince ourselves they deserve it. In a nutshell, with G5s, isn't that it? And is that kind of okay?
Yeah, I think it is. And we had this conversation with when we've looked at rankings from various media pundits. A lot of people want to rank teams based off where they want them to be, not where they should be. And you can't rank a team based off where you want them to be. You have to rank them realistically based off where they are. And that's a tough thing to do. I feel like the AP poll has gotten particularly bad about the fact that they are ranking teams based off where they think they should be or want them to be, not where they are. But, at the end of the day, people want change-ups. Clemson's not making the playoff. Alabama might make the playoff. Georgia will probably make the playoff, and that's something that's only happened once. Cincinnati might make it, and even if they do make it, it certainly feels like Ohio State, Cincinnati, and Oklahoma might have more noise they can make, or even Michigan and Michigan State has a great chance. Everything on the table for Michigan to make the playoff this year. Totally, nobody even really talks about it as a thing, but Michigan could absolutely make this playoff if they just went out. So I do think it's a particularly interesting year, and if you're a fan of seeing something different, you've got it, or at least you've got it in theory, because these teams could also just win out. You could get Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, Oklahoma and then feel like it's the same thing all over again. Even with all the Renaissance craziness we've had, it's kind of crazy.
And Seem Unpleasant really is going to close this out with a great comment that I agree with. There's one clear playoff team and the rest is up in the air. Much more fun than just penciling in Bama, Ohio State, Clemson in a sacrificial lamb. This is the best college football season we've had in a while. I agree. This is the fun and interesting, the intrigue that we need in college football, or we needed it this year after kind of a really usual suspect 2020 and Alabama going wire to wire undefeated. This is what we needed, is all of this chaos. It sucks for your team when they look terrible in a win like Oklahoma and Kansas or Alabama today. That sucks for your team. It sucks even worse when your team loses to Purdue or North Carolina. That's not great either. But collectively as a whole, we're kind of all in this really fun season together. And honestly, nobody should be mad about the outcome this year unless they're a Georgia fan and they don't win. So with that, I'm going to close this out. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. Thanks for hanging with us late on a Saturday